This is the broadcast from City. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Economy, Culture and Skills Committee. Members of the public may like to follow us at London Assembly on X or using the hashtag Assembly Economy. Please may I remind everyone to switch their phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that their electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones like mine just was. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly. So panel members, it's probably better to just bring them forward a little bit, otherwise we do have problems with the sound. And if you need to move your microphone, please do it from the base rather than grabbing it by the actual microphone itself. Today, our main item of business is the committee's ongoing investigation into London's High Street. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee officer, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Clark, for whom Assemblymember McCartney is attending as a substitute.
Thank you. Item 2, can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any interest to declare? Thank you. Item 3, can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of September 2024 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Item 4, can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings? Thank you. And action taken under delegated authority, can I ask the committee to note the action taken by myself as chair of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's letter as outlined in the agenda report? Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London to its letter on London small businesses and the self-employed as attached at Appendix 1 of the agenda report? Now, we move on to our main item of business, which is a discussion on the committee's investigation into London's high streets. The meeting will be split into 2 parts and 2 different panels. I'd like to welcome our first panel. Firstly, Nick Plum, the Associate Director for Policy and Insight, Power to Change. Welcome, Nick. Dr. Jan Kateen, Director of Jan Kateen Architects and Lecturer in Architecture at University College London. Welcome, Jan. Rumi Bose, Place Shaping and Regeneration Consultant, Rumi Bose Limited. Welcome, Rumi. And Chris Paddock, Freelance Economic Consultant. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us. So I will start. So we have a series of questions that will be asked by the committee members, and I will start with a question for all of you. And what I'd like, just for a few seconds, and not much longer than that, just very quickly, you know, a very small biography of what you do. So my first question to all of you is, what have been the main challenges and opportunities for London's high streets since the pandemic? And I'm going to start from this end. So Nick, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my name's Nick, and Associate Director for Policy and Insight at Power to Change. We're a national organisation that works with community-led business across England, and over recent years have done lots of work on high streets and the role of communities in regenerating, reimagining the high street. Challenges from our perspective on the high street are particularly around kind of oversupply of retail space. So I think there's a real challenge with the kind of retail-dominated model of the high street that we think is on its way out, but there's a lot of kind of resistance to that change, which causes all sorts of challenges. Clearly, changing patterns related to work is a huge problem. We've seen data which suggests kind of pre-pandemic, roughly 12% of working adults were working from home. Post-pandemic, that's up to 40%. So huge changing patterns related to work, which have a knock-on effect on high streets and town centres. The disproportionate amount of business tax charged on high street businesses. We were really pleased to see some movement at the recent budget to move away from that model towards a new model that better better reflects the kind of economic impact of businesses and taxes them sufficiently. And then a problem that exists beyond London, which I think is less of a problem here, is on high street vacancy. So in lots of towns, vacancy rates are really high, which leads to a sense of decline, which can in turn lead to antisocial behaviour, social and economic problems. In London, I think that vacancy rates are much lower, so that's less of a problem. But property prices and asset costs are so high that often that prevents kind of a more diverse set of businesses taking part in high street activity. On opportunities, I think for Power to Change, we see a kind of real opportunity in a community-powered high street, a civic high street. So in many ways, looking back to the past and thinking about high streets as places where people came together to mix, connect, form bonds. We see real opportunity for that going forward, and have seen examples across London, across England, of people trying to build more of that civic high street. So that means bringing a bit more residential property into town centres and high streets. It potentially means bringing more public services, civic spaces into the high street, and really making them places of experience rather than retail. So culture, civic offers that bring people in and in turn drive footfall to other businesses. And I guess at the heart of our vision at Power to Change is community ownership on the high street. So getting assets into community hands so that those places can be really responsive to the needs of local residents and local people. And then those sorts of spaces bringing in that mix of different offers that I mentioned. So for us, that's where the real opportunity lies, kind of reimagining the purpose of the high street. We're seeing it in pockets, but much more needs to be done to make it mainstream.
Thank you very much. Jan.
I'm Jan Katijn, Director of Jan Katijn Architects. We've implemented over 30 high street regeneration programmes, most of them in London, a lot of them GLA funded, and specialise in high street regeneration and developing strategies for diversification in high street locations. One of the key challenges that I think we're battling against, aside from what Nick just outlined, is that there is a narrative of decline that's permeating everywhere through the media and public discourse and policy, and that is really detrimental to plotting a positive and aspirational future for high streets. And we all know in this room that high streets have a huge amount to offer, and some of that is undermined by a derogatory way that people speak about high streets. Nobody wants to go to a place that's in decline. People want to go to places that are thriving. And a time, there's certainly high streets are in transition, and a time of transition is often marked by a period of uncertainty. And I think that's what we're in at the moment. There's a great period of uncertainty around the purpose of high streets. The purpose of high streets used to predominantly to meet your shopping needs. We are clearly, as Nick outlined, are moving away from that. But then what is the purpose of high streets? And we need to be much clearer in our messaging and in our policies about what the purpose of high streets is, because there's a risk of a whole generation of young people growing up that don't have a connection to high streets because they don't understand what they're for, what they stand for. High streets are wonderfully inclusive places. All the cultures in London and around the world have a form of high street. And in that sense, they have a really, really important function to maintain and foster democracy, because they're places of negotiation, places of conflict, potentially, but also places of where culture can be expressed, and certainly places where people meet. And in that sense, they have more than ever a huge significance. in the sort of discourse that we need to have. So moving forward, we all need to work on developing a narrative around high streets that are aspirational, that celebrates what high streets have got to offer, that celebrates the sort of work that lots of people around the country do on high streets, whether they're professionals, whether they're community groups, whether they're bids. There is a lot of positive news, but it's often obfuscated by a sort of negativity. In the tabloid press recently again about the decline of high streets, there was a story in the tabloid press about the demise of Homebase, and it was linked to high streets, even though Homebase is not a store that would normally be located in a high street location.
Thank you. Rumi.
Thank you. My name's Rumi Bose, and I'm director of Rumi Bose Limited. I'm a consultant who works with, so I collaborate with and advise clients across the sector in social value, place shaping, strategy and vision to build better places in our towns and high streets. So just building on what's been said, I think challenges are faced on the high street in terms of ownership. Ownership on the high street is very fragmented, and as a starting point, that's quite a difficult sort of context to operate within, because it sort of detracts from what you can and can't do with a unit and with a space. Business rates has been already mentioned, increasingly problematic for business owners, and also the quality of stock. So an asset and how it can be retrofitted to purpose in line with environmental requirements is also difficult. However, those are the challenges, and I think that what my work is very much focused on is about pivoting, thinking about the pivot from retail-led high streets into what the future of high streets can bring. I think having spaces working harder throughout the day is a real opportunity. So hybridization of space at the same time, so going to collect your laundry, having a haircut, picking up a coffee, all in one space. That can sort of help with flexibility, with sort of vibrancy, and also the sort of nighttime economy that we're working across many high streets and town centres. I think there's an opportunity for high streets to be helping to address some of the wider social issues that we encounter up and down the country, healthcare being one of those. High streets helping to plug some of the gap with the NHS, for example, and moving some of those less acute services from hospitals to the high street, so that, as Nick said already, sort of providing some of those public services to address things like food poverty, social isolation, sort of tertiary services within the high street. And we see some of those models in different parts of the world, in Asia, and I think there is an opportunity here in the UK to start testing and trialling some of those on our high streets. Community wealth building, I think, is another great opportunity. We're spending more and more time at home, we're working near home. There is a real opportunity here to sort of use our high streets together and build capacity within communities to sort of own, curate and manage what happens on the high streets. I think arts and culture are another opportunity. That experience of arts and culture is best had in person, and if high streets are not going to be retail-led, how about the idea of having high streets as a platform for creativity and culture?
Thank you. And Chris?
Thank you. My name's Chris Paddock. As you said, I'm a freelance economic consultant at the moment. I'm undertaking an interim role as Portfolio Director for Fairness in the Thames Estuary Growth Board. Before that, I worked as a consultant and have for 20 years advised the GLA and various London boroughs on issues relating to high streets, including a document called High Streets Adaptive Strategies, which was launched in 2020, just before the pandemic, and also leading on the establishment of the GLA High Streets Data Service. In terms of the experience of recovery and some of the opportunities and challenges with that, it really depends on which high street you're looking at. London has 600 designated high streets within the London Plan. If you use the government's definition of a high street, it's double that, and there's a lot of variety within those numbers, which I think maybe belies some of the simplicity of the definition within the London Plan. Just looking back over some of the data from the High Streets Data Service, in terms of the recovery, I think if you look at the national position on high streets, so the high streets generally have recovered to about the level of spending and footfall they were at before the pandemic, statistically, but that's kind of flatlined over the last couple of years. Very limited growth. What growth there is mainly led by sort of discretionary spending, fashion, that sort of thing, but not particularly significant at all. I think if you look at the experience of different types of high streets within London, I think one of the really interesting things was a lot of the big, significant and very visible challenges through the pandemic and coming out of recovery was felt by the larger centres that were more likely to be influenced by external decisions or external structures. So those which were reliant on bigger retailers, those which were reliant on a wider sphere of influence. The smaller centres were actually pretty resilient through the pandemic and have remained pretty resilient since. And I think that's maybe something we didn't expect to see, but is quite interesting in thinking about future policy implications, which I'm sure we'll come on to. I mean, in terms of the challenges, I think fellow panel members have already talked about ownership, the diversity of ownership, but I think also value as well, property values, and I think sometimes owners of space have unrealistic expectations of the value of property, and that can impact upon the ability to innovate and think differently about how space is used. There's still downward pressure on the retail industry more generally. I don't think there's any sort of magical bounce back within the retail sector that's going to take us back to where we were in the mid-90s in terms of the retail sector. So we do need to adapt to that and start to think a bit differently about what high streets are for, as Jan said. I think we also need to recognise when we're thinking about challenges around air quality and the climate resilience of our high street spaces. You know, they are designed for a purpose, and that purpose is exchange of goods and services. They're not necessarily designed for a more resilient climate future. I think within the largest centres as well, I think the smaller centres survive because they're very representative of their local populations. I think some larger centres are not representative enough of the cultural and ethnic diversity of London, and as a result, they're less resilient economically too. I think there's some amazing opportunities. I think we have to remember that high streets are the best connected, often most beautiful spaces where most Londoners have some engagement with the economy. So that's where the real economy plays out in London, and that in itself is an opportunity. 28% of London's jobs are on high streets, 42% of London's businesses are on high streets. So if we're thinking about the economy of London and the future of the economy of London, we have to think about high streets. I agree about the importance of social connection, as Jan and Nick have referred to. I also think there's amazing things that we overlook in the high street economy, which are huge opportunities. I think the circular economy, the repair economy, these are important things which enable us to have a more resilient and a more positive economy for London in the future. But we've tended to historically, for example, vilify charity shops as an identifier of a declining high street. My argument would be they're an identifier of a thriving high street where we reuse goods and limit the impact that our economy has. So I think, you know, the connectivity, the familiarity, and the ability to bring people together actually provide plenty of cause for optimism here.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning all. I'm conscious of time, so if it's something that's been addressed already, don't worry. It's all been recorded, so you don't need to repeat it. So for Chris, my two questions are for you. How have inflation and the rising cost of living and doing business affected the recovery of London's high streets?
Sorry, what was the second part to that question? I beg your pardon.
So I'll just repeat the whole.
Yeah.
So how have inflation and the rising cost of living and doing business affected the recovery of London's high streets?
Okay. So you can see within the statistics, the spending statistics, that the cost of living crisis as borne out by the increase in energy prices and other costs of housing as well. You can see where there are moments of crisis that affects spending on the high street and limits the amount of not just discretionary spend but also essential spend as well. And certainly in some of the locations I've worked in, you know, access to food and basic necessities is impacted by that cost of living crisis, and that is borne out. That's borne out on the high street. There is a resilience, though, that high streets do tend to sort of get back to a certain level. But certainly, if you look around, when was it? Sort of autumn 22, when we had the mini budget. You could see that within the statistics that had an effect on high streets. I think cost of doing business as well. I think if we went back 10 years, we would have identified small business and entrepreneurship as maybe the future of the high street. I think as the costs of establishing a business and maybe some of the wider economic pressures of running a business have borne out, we've probably seen less of that sort of entrepreneurial economy on the high street as the sort of prime function. So yes, it definitely has had an effect.
Thank you. And I guess there's a very brief follow-up, and it can be as short as a yes or no. Mm-hmm. Given COVID restricted and people to their homes and essentially local high streets due to the restrictions at the time, and also hybrid working became more of a thing than it was before, I mean, would you say that sort of in part played a role in revitalising and boosting growth within local high streets?
Yeah, definitely. You can see that within the statistics. The sphere of influence of high streets generally has got smaller, but yeah, certainly certain outer London high streets have become more used, if you like, throughout the week. And within the data, you see bigger high streets and town centres, and particularly central London, influenced by the fact that, you know, less people are working on a Friday, less people maybe coming into town in the evening. So yeah, that's definitely had an effect which has persisted beyond the sort of recent history of COVID.
Thank you. And last question for me on this bit. So when, Chris, once again, when developing a high street or town centre strategy, how do you aim to ensure the long-term economic resilience of the local area? So you've already addressed quite a bit of it, but is there anything you feel that you've missed?
From a personal point of view, I think I'm an advocate of methodologies like community wealth building, where you look at the economy and you look at retaining wealth and spending within that local economy. So, you know, the presence of some big retailers and big shopping centres can be quite extractive, in that you bring in a big business from elsewhere, and that becomes a vehicle for local people to spend their money, and that money then goes out to the area. So actually building systems which enable greater local spending and greater local exchange, you know, and repair and reuse is really, really important. Again, I'd go back to my point on resilience, that we have to think about the climate and ecological resilience as part of the economic resilience of high streets as well, because that will be a cost borne in the future. So as we think about economic strategies for high streets, we can't ignore that aspect of it.
Just to summarise, basically, except for the second bit, which I'm sure is music to Zach's ears, but Assembly Member. But essentially, it's local shops rather than chains. Is that effectively what you're saying? So there's no right or wrong answer, but is that your view?
Yes, essentially it is, and you know, I don't think the chains will come back in the way that some might expect them to. So I think that that is where the economy is at, not just for London, that's the whole of the UK.
Thank you. And Assemblymember George, thank you for mentioning the fact that if you have answered, or if that answer has already come up, please, we've already got it recorded, so do move on in your answers. Assemblymember Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. My question is to Rumi, but I think it might be of interest to others as well, so please do contribute if that's the case. How are changing consumer behaviours, such as the shift to online shopping, which we've mentioned, and the rise in kind of demand for experiential retail, influencing the viability of existing high street businesses?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a challenge that that high street businesses have to step up to. I think it's about competing within that sort of context, as you've talked about, the experience economy, the desire for something different when you go to a shop or a high street is real. I think I often use the Apple Store as a good example of that. You don't have to go to an Apple Store to buy Apple products. You can very quickly and very easily go online and buy what you need to buy. But people go to the Apple Store for the experience. There's lots of things going on. You can go and do a workshop on illustration. I mean, my kids love going there purely to go and sit on the fun stools and things like that. It's an experience to go there. And many other places on the high street are sort of following that trend. Nike Town, Outernet is a good example of that sort of digital experience. I think particularly young people who, want to meet and gather and sort of hang out with their friends, what do they want from high streets? And often it isn't just a store where they can kind of go and shop, but it's a store where they can experience. And it's about creating those experiences and memories that sort of bond people together. And I think that idea of social connection and appealing to different groups in society is something that businesses need to be thinking about. And that can be as simple as a coffee shop as well. It's not just the kind of big Apple stores and Nike Towns.
Can I just add something on that? So completely agree with what Rumi just said there. I think one of the other things that I've experienced quite a lot in high street conversations, I was previously on the government's high streets task force board and went around the country and visited lots of high streets. I think one of the demands, particularly from small business, is how can we sufficiently diversify so we're not just a bricks and mortar business? How can we upskill ourselves to have the ability to play a role in that online shopping sphere? Lots of businesses which have been around for a long time haven't got that sort of kind of digital literacy. So I think there is something, one, about, yes, shifting the kind of the mix and makeup of a high street or town centre, but also enabling those that might be struggling because of the rise of online shopping to play a bigger role in the online shopping marketplace. And sometimes that's around kind of how you provide platforms for them to sell their goods as opposed to setting up kind of individual online stores themselves. So I think there is something about diversification for small business and upskilling for sure.
Yeah, sorry, I just got a couple of, I think, relevant statistics. Just if you look at year-on-year October retail spending stats, there's a 4% growth overall in retail spending. This is in the UK, but that equates to only 1.4% increase in retail spending in store, so below the rate of inflation, as opposed to 9% online. So that trend to online is still persisting, and the in-store growth is negligible. In-store spending is negligible and below the rate of inflation as well.
Thank you all very much for those responses. Start with Rumi again. One thing you mentioned was kind of creative experiences on the high street. And yeah, kind of what role do creative and cultural initiatives play in revitalising high streets currently? What kind of role can they play in the future? And how can they be integrated into long-term regeneration strategies?
I think there's a great role for them. I think, as we know across the board, creative and cultural organisations have an incredible wealth and role to give in regeneration as a whole. And I think that high streets, apply to that too. I think it also ties in very well with the points that have been made about community wealth building and capacity building. Often there are excellent arts and cultural networks locally, creative enterprises locally who are burgeoning, who are, doing their thing in that neighbourhood and sort of amplifying their impact, giving people better access to spaces or lowering the barriers perhaps to entry, or making it easier for creative and cultural organisations to take on a space, to run a space. I think it is really important for our high streets. There's a huge demand for artist studios across London. It's a use that I think complements high streets and vacant buildings, and so I think there's a real opportunity there for working with arts and cultural networks and understanding the funding mechanisms, the funding landscape, in combination with addressing vacancies and all the things we've talked about in terms of business rates, etc., and trying to make those two sort of areas come together to increase footfall and to build high streets.
Is there anywhere kind of like maybe domestically or internationally where you think that's been done particularly well?
I think there are some really good examples around London. A project that I personally worked on a few years ago is Peveril Gardens and Studios. It's not a classic high street building, but it is round the corner from Tower Bridge Road. What it did have in common with high streets is that the ground floor was vacant and it suffered from antisocial behaviour. There were garage spaces. The building was reimagined and retrofitted with a sort of beautifully landscaped garden on the roof, and the garage spaces were imaginatively retrofitted as well to create artist studios, a cafe and a community space. Now that's been given to an operator called Forma, who used to have a tiny little office in Hackney which didn't face outwardly, and so they've benefited massively from having this kind of new ground floor space. They've been able to expand their offer as a cultural organisation, support local artists with low-cost studios, and really activate that ground floor, provide outreach to the community. They work with the girls' school opposite, the care home nearby, and residents in the neighbouring estate. So they've managed to achieve what, say, the local authority might not have been able to achieve on their own. So that creative collaboration with an arts organisation, a vacant building, and some very innovative design has kind of brought together something very special.
Just a couple of other examples which I think are interesting and useful here. So we're doing some research at the moment on the kind of changing use of department stores, and I think that has potential interest in London if there are kind of big anchor tenants, particularly in the outer London boroughs that are moving out. There are two really great examples, Sparks in Bristol and the Haven Community Hub in the Isle of Wight, both of which have repurposed, so in the case of Sparks, an old Marks and Spencer's, and in the Isle of Wight, the Haven department store which really kind of lend themselves well to this mixed use, and both of them have a kind of creative and cultural element, using providing space for makers to kind of come in and small workshop space essentially. So I think that anchor tenants that might be moving out and thinking about what comes next could be a real opportunity for the creative and cultural sector.
Yeah.
Just to add to GLA-funded projects, the 4th Street Living Room Library's been a massive success in Edmonton. There's a community group that's formed around it called 4th Street for All, who have taken over a library that we have retrofitted to be more versatile in its spatial arrangement. And they now run an events and cultural programme there on a regular basis, have organised their own funding around it, and are collaborating across borough boundaries, even with Haringey arts groups as well. So something that started on a high street premises is starting to work itself across a much bigger geographic area. The second project that was also GLA funded is the Ilford Spark Lab that we delivered a few years ago, where the local authority purchased a building that was empty before long-term regeneration plans could be drawn up, and we installed a sort of rolling tenancy of cultural and retail organisations. There was a competitive application process, and it was linked to a bursary, and one of the requirements was to widen participation in high street activity, and that was a massive success in Ilford on the high street. One of the challenges that obviously comes from this shifting or transitioning of high streets into other uses and other types of services is the physical environment. We haven't discussed that much yet. Lots of high streets in London are still dominated by vehicle traffic and are strategic thoroughfares predominantly. This is really undermining their success as cultural destinations and as entertainment venues. And there are examples around the world where the transitioning of the physical space of high streets has been embraced much more rapidly than in London. And I recognise that there are massive challenges that we're facing around public opinion and pushback, but ultimately the majority of Londoners don't rely on cars. And I think we need to be much more forceful, and there needs to be much greater political will to transform the physical environment of high streets to accommodate these new types of uses that we all like to see taking root.
And sorry, just to add one more challenge. If you look at the average salary of an artist from their art in London, it's somewhere between £12,000 and £16,000 a year. So if we're serious about arts and culture playing a role, particularly arts and culture at the creative production end of things, playing a role in the future of high streets in perpetuity, which I think it needs to be, these projects work where they're long-term or they're forever, then there needs to be a realisation that they're probably not going to pay market rents, and there is a need for some subsidy to enable that to happen. But there's a lot of benefit from taking this approach, and I think that's borne out in many of the evaluations I've undertaken over the years.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett. Oh. Sorry, my apologies. It's my very small scribbling. Apologies.
Right.
Assembly Member Bakari has a supplementary there.
Thank you. My question is very relevant to what Jan was just talking about. And I have to say, you really took me back when you were talking about the political aspects of the high street, which I don't think many people really factor in terms of the importance as much. I've been to rallies, vigils, I've done petitions and all sorts on high street, so I think it's such an important aspect. But also you brought in the issue of transport and cars and the impact that has, and I think that was such a relevant question at the moment. There's been an economic assessment assessment on proposed scheme for pedestrianising Oxford Street in 2017, it was actually found to be significant, and it would significantly improve its performance economically, not just, I suppose, also culturally as well, and the other aspects that we've been talking about, and the social aspects. So, I mean, I'm sure any of you could answer this question, but I'll go to Chris first, because I know that you've had quite a range of experiences on this particular issue. What are your views on the schemes of pedestrianising Oxford Street, and the evidence that you've seen of the benefits, perhaps, of pedestrianising generally, economically and socially?
I'm personally a huge supporter of it. If you look, I mean, you can take the economic appraisal at face value, which I think is a rigorous piece of work, which makes the case. So that's one thing. I think if you look at the experience of other European cities that have undertaken significant pedestrianisation, if you look at I think there's a really good example in Ljubljana in Slovenia, obviously a completely different scale to London, where they pedestrianised the entire city centre and took out pretty much all cars, certainly all polluting vehicles from the city centre. That's had a significant improvement in the air quality, the social perception, and also the economic performance of that centre. If you look at Malaga, southern Spain, similar. So I think all the evidence points us in that direction. If you look at it's slightly different, but I think it's relevant. If you look in the High Streets Data Service of research that was done on the impact of low traffic neighbourhoods on high streets as well, they, despite some of the rhetoric around those, very little, well, no negative impact upon the performance of those high streets as well. So I think taking vehicles off high streets, and particularly in the case of Oxford Street, is a positive thing that I fully support.
And just very briefly, could you talk about maybe the local opposition that sometimes might happen, and the impact that has in terms of the process and how it progresses in terms of how you work together to make these things happen? I don't want to go into the next question because it kind of goes into that area, but just specifically on pedestrianisation, is it something that has caused a challenge for local communities at all?
I'm sure other people have got something to say on this, but I'll just briefly. My experience with the Mini Holland projects before, I did data and evidence in Enfield and Waltham Forest, and also on looking at low traffic neighbourhoods. I mean, clearly there's opposition, and for a lot of people, owning and using a car is an important part of their life. So you have to respect that alongside the evidence that these are good things for the economy and society as a whole. So I think it's part of a conversation, and some people are going to feel disadvantaged within that conversation. Often it's a case, I think if you look at sorry, I don't want to go off course too much, but if you look at the experience of the advocating for the Mini Holland projects in Enfield and Waltham Forest, in Waltham Forest is very much a matter of political will. This is going to happen. We will engage in a conversation, but we will deliver this. Where in Enfield, maybe there was a stronger lobby of the business community, and maybe the intervention was delivered in a less significant way. So yeah, I think you have to be respectful of people's not just their sort of economic necessity, but also the cultural importance of owning and using a vehicle as well. But I think that can only be addressed by making evidence available and engaging in a conversation about the benefits and challenges, and it's hard.
I was just going to add and say that obviously the context is hugely important. Oxford Street is a very central location. Most of us get there by public transport. I've recently finished some work in Neasden Town Centre in Brent, which is an entirely different context. And Neasden High Street is is one of those high streets that's blighted by the road infrastructure. It's very much fragmented by the North Circular and several other highways. And to say that this place should be pedestrianised, which of course it could be, causes, as you were saying, a lot of local discomfort. And I know, Jan, you've worked in a similar area, so I just think we have to be mindful about what we can do, what we're asking people to do. The cultural aspect is hugely significant. But I think moving in that direction, it's behavioural change over many years, but also being able to provide alternative solutions and enabling conditions that help people sort of understand or help people manage how they sort of travel to and from town centres. But we can't, you can't pedestrian Neasden town centre and expect, that just couldn't happen at the moment anyway.
There are two things to add to that conversation. I mean, what I'm experiencing also, that often there is a quiet majority that actually is quite supportive, and there is sometimes a risk of them feeling very disenfranchised by a small group of very noisy opposition members. So I think, again, to talk about the role of high streets in relation to democracy, and I know it takes political will, but sometimes that painful decision needs to be made in order to respond to the needs of that quiet majority that there is. We're finding this a lot in Islington and inner London, where there's a very vocal, relatively small minority that are vociferously objecting to low traffic neighbourhoods and removal of traffic, whereas the statistics are that only 23% of households have access to a vehicle, and the other 77 would quite clearly benefit from such moves. So whilst there is sensitivity needed and education needed, there also needs to be a degree of political will to move into the right direction, and a recognition that there will always be some people who will oppose. I suppose the second thing I wanted to say in relation to this is the way the narrative is framed. I find it very difficult, or experience great difficulty, if the purpose of a pedestrianisation scheme is seen as pedestrianisation. Pedestrianisation may be the consequence of other things, economic growth, greater well-being, and I think we are sometimes reticent to foreground these benefits, and they can be really powerful if people genuinely see all those positives initially, and then maybe quite logically pedestrianisation or removal of vehicular traffic is the consequence of that. But if pedestrianisation is seen as a means to an end, then there can be a lot of objection.
Thank you. And now, Assemblymember Garrett.
I'm sure it was worth the wait. A question probably to Rumi and Chris about sort of partnership working. So often a high street regeneration is going to involve some public sector, private sector, community, possibly community groups. What challenges have you run into? Perhaps I'll start with you, Chris. Well, perhaps Rumi, because actually you've had less to say just recently, so we'll even things out. What are the challenges that you've run into in terms of managing the conflicts or different preferred outcomes or agendas of those different groups, and perhaps other groups besides those three, when you're trying to get a high street regeneration agreed or up and running?
I think, in my experience, that partnership work is almost always a situation where the end game, the aims, the whole ethos of the project or partnership that's happening is common, is shared. There's a shared vision. I think one of the key challenges that surfaces is the sharing of risk. There's often an asset or a building involved, and therefore some kind of covenant or lease. We've talked about lowering barriers to entry and enabling. And I think if a local authority or a landowner, on one hand, is working in partnership with an operator, a small business, a creative or cultural organisation, there needs to be a sharing of risk that's proportionate to the organisation, and I think that's sometimes not the case, or often not the case, whereby the smaller organisation, the cultural organisation, or whatever it is expected to take on too much risk, or pay too much, or have not enough time on the lease to be able to create a significant return. So I think those sorts of challenges to do with properties and leases and value and cost and sharing of risk is something that I think needs to be addressed. And where it is addressed and is shared fairly, or the trust is there, I think that's where things can flourish and do flourish.
So sharing of risk where you've got lots of parties involved in trying to make it a success.
Well, I think more like, so for example, I've worked on projects where there's a building, it's owned by a council, and what could be done is quite a long-term meanwhile lease on a peppercorn rent, for example, that really enables an organisation to come in, make an impact, not have to worry too much about that side of things in terms of overheads. It's a tough climate. They're being asked to deliver a number of other social outputs, like, jobs or skills training, or offering these sorts of activities to the local community. So they're working very hard to deliver those sorts of things. So let's make it easier for them and not ask them to, well, they have to provide a return, or they have to provide, this level of rent. I've worked with businesses. I've worked in a local authority where colleagues in the property department are just too hard-nosed in that sense, and they're asking for a fixed-term lease, for example, and the operator's asking for that to be sort of softened a little bit. Could we have a little bit of rent-free, or could we not have a fixed term because we're not sure? Could we have a profit share, for example? And that sort of flexibility isn't allowed for often within that sort of property context. And I think just that's what I mean by sharing of risk, or sort of a little bit of flexibility to help. When a small business is struggling, it's not the same as when a council is sort of, demanding the rent. There's a different capability there. We're talking about livelihoods of people and people being able to put food on their table if they're a small business owner, whereas if you're a local council officer and you're not, shifting on the lease. So I think that's a very kind of granular example, but I think that's the sense of what I'm talking about in terms of sharing risk.
And, I suppose it's about understanding what people's options are, and their, not just their risk, their willingness to make a commitment, I suppose, or their ability. Yep. Chris, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, in terms of partnership, obviously there's always a power imbalance, and I suppose the organisations which would tend to be developers and landowners which have more resource will tend to have more power in the conversation about the future of high streets. And I think, that's fine, that's to be expected. But often they maybe hold imperfect information and don't necessarily have an understanding of the area. And where that's been challenged, certainly my experience in the last decade, is just the lack of capacity within the councils, within the boroughs, and also within the GLA to have that function of working in partnership with developers and landowners to educate and inform them. These, as we've already talked about, these are very complex, agile and contested spaces, and the situation changes all the time. One of the reasons I advocated so hard for the High Streets Data Service was just to have better information, to have more informed conversations. So I think that's really important. I also think the way we engage with communities, and that can be residents, it could be visitors, it could be businesses, is also not great all of the time. So, for example, I've done lots of work in Newham and lots of work in Stratford. If you go out and do community engagement on the high street or on the town centre in Stratford, you'll be talking to people who've probably been consulted 6 or 7 times over the last 5 years on the future of something or the future of something else. People are asked for their opinion, but they're not necessarily asked for their agency, and I think that in itself can be quite disempowering. So that's why I advocate for Nick's work, Empower to Change, and others so much, because actually giving communities a role and empowering them in the partnership is incredibly important.
Okay. Oh, Nick, go on.
Just a couple of small things to add. So the research from the High Street Task Force found that lack of the right partnerships is the single biggest thing holding back high streets. That's across the country. So not having the right people in the room making those decisions about the future direction of high streets, lack of partnerships, lack of shared vision. And just to build on what Chris was saying, I think, it's really important that there's a kind of equal seat at the table from as early on as possible, particularly in relation to community and residents. So I think often there can be kind of really productive conversations between the business community and local authorities, and then the kind of community engagement comes later. It's a bit of a tick box, and that's when you get that kind of disempowerment. So for me, it's about engaging as early as possible and getting the right people around the table to form that partnership, so that as the project develops, you've got a whole range of different voices. And I think, just back to some of the previous conversation around pedestrianisation, I think that's, it's especially important there as well, because you'll have a business view which might be take you in one direction, view of residents which might take you in the other, and ensuring they're all part of that is really important. So equal seat at the table from as early as possible from my perspective.
Could I just come back on that as well? I think we've got 2 very prominent examples of where partnerships have gone wrong in London that I've had some involvement in, and they're both incredibly interesting but also troubling as well. I think Queen's Market in Newham, East Ham, Queen's Market and Hamaragar redevelopment over 15 years has failed to offer the community agency, and the nature of the partnership as defined there is becomes a commercial thing. It's a joint venture partnership between the public and the private sector that largely in the first instance excluded the traders and the communities, and to the detriment of the project, which still continues to be, it's improving, and Newham have put in some terrific work to move that along. I also sit on an independent advisory group on Seven Sisters Market at Ward's Corner in Haringey in Tottenham. A similar thing, a public sector entity entering into a partnership with the private sector without adequately involving the community in those discussions. So and I think we've moved on from those. We've learnt from those examples, but it's still worth recognising we are where we are because of that failure to think more broadly about what a partnership actually is.
Okay, just sort of rounding off. I was struck some of the background reading I did preparing for this. There was a report by PwC, store openings and closures. Most recent one being first half of 2024, and they categorise sort of these spaces into 3 groups. They've got high streets, which obviously is what we're primarily talking about, shopping centres, and retail parks. And high streets, they correctly identify, are not doing very well. Shopping centres have already in place many of the things that we've been talking about. So they have a unified ownership and management. It's able to create a sort of unified retail experience potentially for the people going there, and more easily able to, with a single landlord, pivot to different kinds of, let's say less clothing retail, more coffee shops or something. And they are doing better than high streets, but they're still struggling. And then the third category, retail parks, seem to be thriving. Footfall is up, openings are up. They seem to be the only type of area where it's going well. The phrase they use is retail parks are the only location type bucking the declining trend and showing improvement in footfall in each of the last 12 months, and they put that down to the fact that people can easily drive their park and do their shopping very easily. And so I wonder, are we missing something important here, which is that the one retail area that's doing really well is the one that's doing the exact opposite of all of the things that we've just been talking about for the last hour, which is making it harder for people to drive into town centres, harder for people to park, harder for people to get in and out, and just have a very straightforward shopping experience. I don't know whether anyone has a thought on that research. It seems quite significant that the hard data that we have does contradict some of what we've heard.
Okay, so obviously that's firstly that's the UK experience, not the London experience, and I'm not surprised by that. I think also, as well as the ability to drive there, which is a factor in the success, no doubt, and park for free, and all of the things they talk about within that report. I think also because a lot of those big out-of-town shopping centres are owned by long-term institutional investors, there's an ability to offer sort of flexibility on leases and turnover leases, which make it an easier proposition to move to move in and indeed move out of those sorts of spaces. That sort of flexibility helps as well. And obviously there's a lot of those sorts of shopping centres in London, particularly in outer London. I suppose what I would say on that is we need to balance. There is a discussion about car usage, which sits outside of the retail. So we need to say, well, actually, is reducing car usage more or less important than the future of retail and its importance to the economy? And that is a debate to be had, I would say.
I mean, life is about trade-offs. So if the trade-off is you have to get rid of your car and then our high streets all collapse, maybe we should just at least understand that is a trade-off that we're making. 100%. Nick.
I guess one thing to add from my perspective, I think that, I think there is something about the kind of design and geography of these. So retail parks designed to accommodate cars, designed to, to be places that people drive to. And I think that's important to recognise that often our high streets aren't set up in the same way. And so I think, for me, there's, I share lots of the views personally on kind of pedestrianisation and the importance of that, particularly on high streets. I also think there's a role for having a kind of different ways that people shop, and if people are using retail parks to do lots of their shopping, then that opens up a bit more opportunity for high streets to shift their purpose slightly. So, I think it's important to just think about how the way in which they've been purpose-built and how that accommodates a slightly different role for the high street that isn't just about retail.
But do you think that trade-off is understood? Because until I brought it up, nobody else brought it up. Like, nobody said LTNs, restricting pedestrianisation, restricting parking in town centres, these are the benefits of that. By the way, here's this massive disbenefit that actually people might just get in their car and go somewhere else, and then all your shops will close. I don't remember anyone flagging up that was a potential trade-off.
So
perhaps I'm exaggerating for rhetorical effect, but the data is not rhetorical. The data is clear that high streets are struggling the most, shopping centres are in the middle, and retail parks are thriving, apparently.
So, I don't think it's as stark as all the shops will close on the high street. I think that there's definitely recognition that one of the reasons, so for me, alongside the rise in online shopping, out-of-town retail is one of the key reasons that high streets are struggling. I think that's well understood across the high streets community, and that's been a long-term trend. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Sorry, Rumi, did I see you signalling?
I just wanted to come in and just thinking as you're speaking. The way I see it is I don't see it quite as a trade-off. I think it's really interesting. I think they're slightly different entities. So retail parks, typically you have large floor plate stores like IKEA's or sofa workshops or those sorts of things where you're perhaps going with the family at the weekend, parking, you might have something to eat. It's an experience, in effect, on a Saturday afternoon. The high street is a different entity. It's your daily offer. So you've got your pharmacy, your post office, your coffee shop, your laundrette, and shops, maybe a cinema, So I think that there's a different role to play here. And we're talking about pivoting and what high streets can offer. And I think I always go back to that sort of idea of towns and markets from ancient times. So as a civilization, we use our local town or our local market to gather, to trade and exchange, to be entertained, to share food and drink. And I think that role, that social role of connectivity, as we've talked about in the high street, is so important. And we need to do some things as a society to tweak and change what that role is for the high street. And I guess my point is just that the high street has a very specific role as an entity that I think is slightly different from a retail park. It's not a place of connection. We don't go to retail parks to gather and to meet people. We tend to go as a family to do something together. And I think that role is slightly different.
Perhaps in Outer London
I'm
people
really,
do that, but I will
really
end my
sorry,
questions there.
Assembly Member Gow. We are now running behind, but thank you. So we're now moving on to our second section, which you've all referred to, which is about reimagining the high street, and we're looking at bids and community-led regeneration. And members, we are behind, so I'm going to ask you to take responsibility for only directing your question to the person that's listed, please. So, Assembly Member Giorgio.
Thank you. And don't worry, Chris and Jan, soon in Enfield there won't be a single LTN left. So for Jan specifically, how have consumer expectations and behaviours towards high streets changed in recent years, especially in the wake of the pandemic? And what are the key trends that high street businesses need to adapt to? Now, once again, I think Chris covered off my question before about the pandemic. So is there anything you feel that's been missed before we move on?
I think there probably is, because the pivoting and change of business models and high street users has got physical implications. We are finding there is a great demand for very small spaces that potentially are exempt from business rates. There is still a very archaic lease system in the UK which excludes and slows down the transitioning of high streets. There's generally still an expectation that one signs a 10 or 20-year lease, and that one also brings a significant investment to fit out a shell and core premises, or a premises that isn't in a state that's fit for occupation. So one of the things that we've been involved with is establishing complementary retail and workspace spaces on high streets that have got very small units, that have got very easy in and out conditions for businesses. So you don't sign a long-term lease, you serve a month's notice and you're out. There's no deposit to pay. There are often management structures by workspace operators that allow you to very quickly get peer support and stabilise, access business support, stabilise as an enterprise. So I think the GLA has supported a lot of these projects in London in the last 10, 15 years since the Outer London Fund and the High Streets Fund. But this is a trend that certainly we need to keep supporting also through planning. There is still a misunderstanding around what active streetscapes and active frontages mean, in that quite often in new development, large retail areas are being provided, and that are aimed at the sort of chains that we see departing from high streets, rather than a real understanding of the needs of very local organisations, so entrepreneurs who are very distinct from what the big Sainsbury's and Tesco's and Costas of these worlds need. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. And I actually completely agree with your sentiments with regard to short leases and business rates. I think business rates are an abomination of a tax, which really do destroy our high streets. So, Jan, according to the Centre for Cities, cities like Birmingham and Manchester are outperforming London in terms of the post-pandemic recovery, with footfall in Birmingham around 55% of pre-pandemic levels, Manchester at 50% and London at just 36%. Therefore, despite COVID impacting the whole of the UK, why is London doing so badly compared to the rest of the country? And mind you, which you may say, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, that London is outperforming, we're doing really well, which London is the greatest city in the world. Everyone in this room believes that. How can we be better in responding to that question?
At the risk of repeating what people said previously, I think property values in London are significantly higher than in those other two locations, and there's still a reticence on behalf of landowners to lower the rental expectations. Often rental expectations are used in business models in order to justify other borrowing or investment in other properties and in a property portfolio. So lowering rents is something that a lot of landlords are prepared rather to have units empty than to lower rents and to adapt them to the market. And I think in Manchester and Birmingham, rents have never reached the levels that.
But how does that impact footfall?
That's an interest. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it has to do with obviously a slower diversification of businesses. We are still looking at more of the standard businesses that can afford the high rents, rather than in areas where new players can move in and respond to the needs of the experience economy and the expectations that people have in discovering something new and unusual on the high street. So that's certainly slowed by higher rents, and there may be more innovation that's moving in Birmingham and Manchester, where the odds aren't stacked against you if you've got an innovative and mad idea as a business.
So just to summarise, essentially, is because of high rents and high property prices, we're not getting the businesses in that people may want on their high street. Is that accurate?
That could be said, yes.
OK, thank you. How significant is the shop local movement in reimagining high streets, and what strategies can businesses and local authorities use to encourage greater community support in local businesses? Now, you've already answered the first part of the question, so the second part of the question is, very briefly, how can we get local councils essentially to do more? The mayor's power is relatively restricted when it comes to local high streets, but with regard to local authorities, have you got good case studies of what local authorities are doing to bring a more vibrant high street feel to their boroughs?
I mean, high streets have always been places of innovation, and I think we need to come back to that place rather than seeing them as places that are in decline, that they are places of innovation. But innovation needs investment. And actually, the mayor has done incredible projects over the last few decades in supporting innovations in high street settings. Sustainability and circular economy are certainly something that Chris has mentioned earlier that I see we need to move towards much faster than we are, and the mayor can do that by supporting these sorts of activities, by providing capital grants to transform underused spaces and adapt them to those new uses, by supporting, as the mayor has done in the past, community organisations in designing office and designing governance structures that allows them to take on premises on high streets, and by providing revenue funding that encourages cultural activities and people that are pursuing innovation to actually concentrate on the challenge at hand. So I think the other thing, and finally I've been saying this to colleagues, officers in the GLA for years, there's been amazing work done in London, and we are often too concerned about moving on to the next project rather than understanding the previous one and celebrating it. There's a wealth of examples, and somebody's got to go and collate those and share that knowledge and understanding that we've gained over the last 20 years in working on incredibly innovative and forward-looking initiatives on high streets.
I think just, Jan, if it would be very helpful, and I don't want to create more work for you, after the meeting it would be very helpful, given what you've just said, in getting officers to understand what went well and what didn't, if you could send a list that, just very briefly, what you think did work well, and ones that actually made us morally feel very good, but actually in terms of return for spend didn't achieve very much. So that would be very helpful if you could. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. And my question is to Chris. That's about business improvement districts. Have they been effective?
Blimey. Have business improvement districts been effective? I think in central London, where the business improvement districts have a significant budget and a significant yield from the business rates, I think they have been and are effective. And actually, in a lot of the things that I've talked about, particularly in moving to more ecological, socially responsible solutions to high streets, I think where they have the budget and the capacity, they've been effective in their impact, and also filling a void that's been left by a lack of funding and lack of resource within the public sector. I think they're, I suppose it's horses for courses. They're maybe less effective in smaller centres. I think there was a move that, like, bids were ubiquitously the solution to the high street and the town centre, but actually in smaller centres where you might only be generating 50 to £100,000 from the levy, and then you're creating a bureaucratic structure which needs to manage the partnership that sits behind the bid. I think my view is they can be a distraction, although they're an important partnership in advocating for the business community in that area. They're maybe not the best way of doing that. But where there is scale and representation, then I think they are effective.
Okay, thank you. I'll be interested when Zach asks his questions about community involvement, whether bids have been useful in that as well. Thank you.
Sorry, while I'm turned on, could I just make a very quick point about Assemblymember Giorgio's data on Centre for Cities, because I think this is important. The Centre for Cities data looks at city centres, and I think we just have to be careful in comparing the central activity zone of London with the city centres of Birmingham and Manchester, because I don't think they're directly comparable. And if we're talking about high streets and footfall in London as a whole, if you defer to the High Streets Data Service, you'll see that footfall has increased above the rates in Manchester and London, in many of the outer London centres, and a lot of the smaller high streets as well. So just wanted to urge a bit of caution with that.
Thank you for that clarification. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Chris, just to balance some of the rhetoric from before, if I want to zoom out a little bit, we've got droughts across South America, we've got wildfires across West Africa, and in Valencia we saw deadly floods, including last night, and it seemed to be torrential rain, which thankfully they were more prepared this time. At the same time, we're missing our carbon pathway in London, and traffic reduction has to be a part of that. You talked about circular economy before. Sparks and Bristol's also been mentioned today, and I know they're doing climate education. Do you think there's a role on the high street for this kind of climate educational spaces that can be about making sure there's those community spaces to spread information?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just for additional background, I founded a community interest company called the London Donut Economy Coalition, which advocates for more social and ecological responses for London's economy, and we're currently doing a high street project looking exactly at that sort of thing. And I think in doing the audits that we're doing for that work, just looking at not just the function of the high streets in bringing people together to talk about climate education, but also the high streets themselves as climate resilient spaces, and recognising not just the climate crisis, but also the ecological and habitat crisis we have in London and all cities in the UK is an important part, I think, of the longer term solution, well, the shorter term solution as well.
Thank you, and hopefully with that too, even places like Neasden, we can have a conversation about the need to invest in public transport and eventually change the dynamic of those places too. Nick, you mentioned earlier about having an equal place at the table for communities. I just want to dig into that a little bit more, kind of what that looks like, because it's already been referenced, so we don't need to repeat too much, that sometimes it's the loudest voices are the ones that are heard. How can we make sure that underrepresented groups are included in these plans, particularly around regeneration?
Yeah, really good question. And I think for me, quite a bit of this comes back to Assembly Member McCartney's question on business improvement districts. So Power to Change over the last couple of years has been piloting this idea of a community improvement district. So 2 places in London, Kilburn, Wood Green, alongside GLA colleagues, and then 5 other places across England. And all of that work came from that understanding that we were hearing from community organisations that in so many cases they were shut out of conversations around regeneration, high streets, town centres. One of the things that I think has been really effective about with business improvement districts is having that levy and that sustainable source of income, even in smaller town centres and high streets where that levy is still small. Where the sum of the levy is small, it still gives you that consistent income stream to bring people together, to run marketing campaigns, to clean up the high street, to think about the small things that bring people into high streets and town centres. So I think there's lots to be applauded in the business improvement district model. I just think it's really patchy how well they do that community engagement. Our work on community improvement districts was really trying to think, how could you evolve that model? And we had mixed results across the country. I think really depends on context. I think that one of the things that we learned through the process was not always starting with the model. So we were saying, let's try and bring these things into being, and that was the starting point. So often the starting point needs to be a conversation that matters to people in that place, and then build from there, think about the governance that sits around it afterwards. And then the other challenge for us, which we're still grappling with and still thinking about work on, is how you fund a community improvement district. So the levies on existing businesses that pay business rates, there's always going to be a tension with, so we're paying the levy, the business improvement district should do this for us. How do you get the community voice in? Well, you don't want to add to the tax burden for local residents. There's been some really interesting work up in Scotland where social housing provider paid a kind of lump sum each year to ensure that their residents were part of business improvement districts in Glasgow, kind of deprived bit of Glasgow. So I think for me that question around funding, so how you can have a sustainable organisation as you do with a business improvement district, but one that has a more diverse set of voices, and the big challenge there is funding from my point of view.
Can I just check, so it was implicit in what you said that if you pay people for their time and effort, that means that people who might have been locked out of the process otherwise are able to give their time, effort and labour? Yeah,
and I think there is something about the perception from members of business improvement districts that so we're paying our levy, therefore it should do this thing. And then there's a whole set of outside voices that to feel like they genuinely have that seat at the table alongside them, there needs to be some other source of income that is kind of building that sustainable pot of money that keeps the business or community improvement district going.
And presumably separated, so there's no kind of look that it looks like the business are paying people to say what they want to say.
And I think one of the interesting models that came through in a few of the community improvement district pilot projects that we worked on was, so after some initial, we provided small bits of initial grant funding. In some cases where the local authority saw the real value of having a slightly altered version of their business improvement district, have decided to put small bits of grant in to do that role. And so I think that's a question for London authorities, is if you want to kind of slightly change the shape of the business improvement district, could you play a role in supporting some of the community to get involved?
Brilliant, thank you. Now, at the beginning of the meeting, you talked about the vacancy rate in London being a lot less than some other cities. My colleague Sean Berry, who's now an MP, did a report about this last year or 2 years ago called Dead Spaces, Bringing London Back to Life. And she did FOIs of various councils and the buildings they owned. I think 20 of them replied, or maybe a little bit less.
Yeah.
We found about 400 buildings that were empty. If you take the average from the buildings that didn't reply, we're looking about 800 buildings at least owned by councils.
Yeah.
Now, not just councils, but also other buildings are empty. Would you support kind of a community right-to-buy type scheme?
Yes, absolutely. So that's something that Power to Change has done lots of work on, and we're really pleased to see the current government pick that up in their manifesto, and we're set to see the community right to buy be introduced through the forthcoming devolution bill, which I think is a real opportunity to change that ownership picture on the high street, which has been mentioned by a couple of colleagues as being really challenging, having that kind of fragmented ownership picture. We think inserting more community ownership in there is really important. I'd also point to there was a press release from the government yesterday around high street rental auctions. So this was an idea that was initially kind of devised by the previous government, but has been taken on by the current government. So if you've got a community right to buy coming down the track in the next couple of years, there's also a right to rent, which is coming into force in the next month or so. I think they're due to announce a few kind of trailblazer areas that will get first access to that right. I'm not sure where those places are. It'd be interesting if any of those are in London. I think just on the right to buy, one of the things that we've found working with lots of organisations that are involved in community ownership is you also need kind of funding and support to sit alongside that. So access to finance, whether that's repayable or grant, and then some of that early stage capacity building support to ensure that the kind of good ideas that people have are able to be turned into kind of viable business models, able to be turned into projects that deal with the challenges of engaging with contractors, suppliers, often which aren't kind of there in every community. So making sure that sits alongside it would be really important.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And Jan, finally, can I just ask from your perspective what's important about engaging local communities in terms of how to do it effectively?
I mean, it's obviously to hear everybody's voice, but what hasn't been said yet is the importance of a full and wholehearted buy-in as a prerequisite to placemaking and a sense of ownership and civic pride. So co-creation is an incredibly powerful method, also in high street regeneration, for people to take ownership of the ultimate outcome of a regeneration effort. And we discussed earlier the importance of local shopping and local shops, and there isn't a better way of people engaging people with that message than having those conversations with them through regeneration processes and ensuring their voice is heard. So that's a sort of critical, I think a critical step that needs to be taken.
I guess one very final question. Before as a politician, I was a theatre actor working in immersive theatre, often in places like high streets, working in older kind of abandoned buildings. It just strikes me that art probably has a role here to play in terms of people imagining what the high street could look like, not necessarily theatre, but various ways. Does anyone on the panel know of any work that's being done that's engaging with art or drama to imagine a future?
With design. Would that be good enough? Does that match your... Yeah, so we did a wonderful project working with two schools in Waltham Forest, at one of them located at either end of a high street that was failing. And we worked with the teachers on a STEM curriculum that would teach economics, design and geography around a high street environment. So we worked with 400 school children that ultimately got a lot of their teaching from high street traders. We took them out, they discussed business models and started to understand what it means to run a shop on the high street. We then run a module on design to reinvent shopfront designs and how businesses present themselves creatively with the children. The teachers took this forward, and the children themselves designed ideas of new high street shops in shoebox models. And all of that ultimately led to a big publicly funded regeneration effort of the public realm and of the shops. And this is one of the most wonderful success stories, as Francis wrote in Waltham Forest in Leighton, which was set up to fail and which has been fully embraced by communities that are feeling very attached personally through the experience that the school children had to that high street and supporting that high street.
I love it. I'm really glad I asked. Chris.
Can I add to those?
I'm really sorry, Assemblymember Polanski and Chris. We are very short on time now, so I am going to move on to the next Assemblymember. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. Can I just say, as representing Enfield and Haringey, I know quite a lot about the bid work that went into Wood Green, and I think that is a particularly effective and innovative one. But my question is really about how we identify declining high streets, what we can do about them. So I was interested, you said about charity shops, because I think the younger generation have really embraced charity shops. My children go there, and I think our generation perhaps thought it's somewhere to go if you were a bit hard up. Now it seems as about reinventing and whatever. But my postbag on high streets is particularly around the plethora of gambling. And I think that is gambling venues that really get local residents irate. They think it's quite alien to the ethos they want in their high street. So I just wanted a quick question. Do you think local authorities need better powers to shape what is actually on there? I know there's a process you can get an Article 4 designation, but it does seem to be quite lengthy and quite onerous. Is there a role for further devolution of powers to local authorities?
I'll go first. And yes, I think that's important, and I think empowering local authorities in this space is a big part of the solution. I think it has to be accompanied by deeper discussion about what we value in the high street as well, because the reason why there's so many betting shops is they will pay higher rents and they drive spending. So if we're valuing higher rents and spending and uplift in land values, then that's what the market's going to deliver for us. If we're valuing as civic pride, or we're valuing culture, or we're valuing political discussion or innovation, then we'll get a different a different solution. But that's a tricky conversation. But I think you need to do the two things together rather than just being a blunt sticking up a blunt barrier to the market, if that makes sense.
I agree completely, and I think absolutely yes. I think the solutions can't be blunt. The solutions have to be a little bit more nuanced, and I think that devolution, whether it's devolution of powers or policies that can enable local authorities to be a bit more nimble and agile in terms of their decision making, would be really useful. And I think addressing Assemblymember Georgiou's point about what can local authorities do, I think that sort of activity, the sort of gambling, along with issues such as waste management, antisocial behaviour and parking, are probably the top 3 or 4 issues that local authority high street officers or officers working across high streets come up with across London, and I would say in the UK as well. Waste management is huge. Littering, you can spend all the money you want on good, innovative, thoughtful, considered design and public realm, shop local initiatives, but waste management and antisocial behaviour, street drinking, it just comes up time and time and time again. And I think the convening power of local authorities, or the convening power of the GLA with local authorities to try and crack some of these solutions with a more nuanced approach and devolution, I think, would be really interesting to think about.
I'm so sorry, we are going to have to move on to the last question. And the question is for all of you, and I really would appreciate brevity in your answers. What impact do you think the Mayor has had on high streets in London, and what further support do you believe is necessary from both the Mayor and central government to ensure that high streets remain resilient in the face of future challenges? And I wonder, Jan, if we could start with you.
I think the Mayor's had an absolutely phenomenal impact on high streets in London. There are obviously still huge challenges, but just the turning around of the narrative of failure into a positive message and repurposing high streets as spaces that are for democracy, spaces that are for culture, spaces that are for art. The Mayor has supported that with advice, with messaging, with funding, over the last 20 years, and I think it is being copied and looked at all across the world, actually. Some of the central government funding rounds that have gone out, levelling up funding and things like that, these things were born in London. The ideas came out of the Mayor's activities here. So absolutely phenomenal. I think one of the big things that the Mayor could still do is thinking about of the remit and purpose of TfL. TfL still advocates for mobility over place, and maybe the renaming of TfL into a public space for London rather than Transport for London would shift that perception that high streets and public spaces aren't about mobility primarily. I think some of the funding routes, like the High Street Fund, the Outer London Fund, the High Streets Fall funding, should be reinstated. It's delivered phenomenal outputs, engaged 10,000s of Londoners. There needs to be greater emphasis put on to supporting young people and creating spaces for young people in town centres so that there's a sense of ownership, because those young people will be the next generation who work and use high streets, and unless we can make clear to them what high streets stand for and what they are, that decline will continue into the next generation. I leave it there to leave something for others to say.
Thank you, Jan. Rumi.
I would say, as has been touched on already, something around the asset ownership, whether that's moving towards community asset ownership, whether it's addressing issues such as absentee landlords, but trying to address some of these problems that arise due to fragmented ownership, lack of stewardship and authorship would be something that I think would be really useful.
Thank you. Chris?
Just to agree with what Jan says, I think the Mayor's approach and High Streets for All and the Good Growth by Design is the best in the world that I've seen, and I have the privilege of speaking to other cities, and it's always an example that people want to talk about, so we shouldn't forget about that because it's important. From a government point of view, still, the business rates reform stuff looks good, but it needs to happen more quickly. I'd probably also advocate for some form of turnover tax as well, because I think turnover rents work within the private sector. I think turnover tax, which maybe enables some redistribution from the retailers in the out-of-town shopping centres to support the evolution of town centres and high streets, kind of makes sense. I also think the Treasury needs to think about how they value things. We're still working in a landscape where land value uplift is the predominant tool used to make business cases, and there's better guidance now on well-being and natural capital, but the Treasury doesn't use it enough, and I don't think it's advocated for use by a local level as well. So I think that's important. For the GLA, I think we're at a point now where we can start to think beyond retail, and actually thinking about the economy of high streets and taking the transaction out of it is an interesting place to start. So lots of the other broader things that we've talked about and mentioned around culture and innovation, ecological diversity, just thinking about that value proposition and how that affects what high streets are for is really important as well, but I'll leave it there.
So just to build on something Rumi was saying, yeah, I think that the challenge of asset prices, whether that's rental or ownership, has come up lots during this session. So wonder whether a kind of future mayoral high streets fund could support community ownership or occupation of assets on the high street. I think the convening role that the GLA can play with local anchor institutions and organisations, TfL's been mentioned, but the NHS, universities, could they play a convening role in helping access vacant space for the community? I'd really urge the GLA and local councils to make use of those new powers that I mentioned: high street rental auctions, community right to buy when it comes into force. And then the final thing for central government, I think the High Streets Task Force, which was running over the last 5 years, has done lots of good. It's now come to an end, so thinking about what comes after that. Power to Change has done some work on something we're calling a civic high streets accelerator, which would build on the High Streets Task Force but bring in a more diverse set of expertise. So that would be something for central government from my point of view.
Thank you very much. And my apologies to Assembly Member Garrett. I got ahead of myself and asked his question rather than mine, which is the next one to the next one. Very, very brief supplementary, please, Assembly Member Garrett.
Yeah. It just strikes me we've been talking about this for a long time. Mary Portas, which might seem recent, was more than a decade ago. And lots of the examples that we've heard here, like the experience economy, Apple and Nike, those are high-value, high-margin products that generate spillover cash to do lovely things in the shop. And places I've been to where I've seen good high streets, like York or Tours in the Loire, wealthy places with wealthy tourists. So they're playing on easy mode. So my question is there a formula, is there an example of a set of ideas that you can deploy and say this will consistently generate good results in the high street? Or are we still perhaps being a bit more humble and thinking we're in experimental mode where we're trying to understand, try different things and see what works? Chris, you leaning forward eagerly?
Because it was something that I forgot to say my summary there. I think, yeah, if you go to York or you go to Tours or Bath, you will see the economy that is representing the population that's using it. I suppose that's the everyday economy for that population. The everyday economy for the population of Plaistow in Newham will be completely different, but it is still fundamentally a very important part of the commercial value of that space. So I think we need to understand that everyday economy more. And in some cases, that will be about healthcare and health provision. It will be about childcare, and so understanding the sort of basic necessities and how the everyday economy, which is something Rachel Reeves has written about a lot herself in the past, and how that functions, and recognising that it's horses for courses is an important part of that. But I think that's a good starting point.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're now at the end of today's first part of our investigation, and thank you very much to the panel for attending and for your fantastic answers. We will now adjourn for 5 minutes to allow swap over of panels, and thank you very much. Okay, welcome back to the Economy, Culture and Skills Committee meeting, where we are discussing London's high streets. I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests. Louise Duggan, who's the Head of Regeneration and Growth Strategies at the GLA. Welcome, Louise. Tim Rettler, the Area Manager South for Regeneration, Growth and Strategies, GLA. Hello, Tim. Grace Nelson from the London Borough of Brent, who's the Town Centre Manager for Harlesden, Church End and Willesden Green. Welcome. And Elizabeth Harris, the Regeneration and Growth Service Manager for Sutton Council. Welcome, Elizabeth. So we're going to ask you all a number of questions, and I'm going to start off. So we are a little bit behind, so for panel members and for assembly members, we're a little bit behind. Really would appreciate brevity in questions, and if we could just do brief answers as well, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. So, to all of you, to Louise and to Tim, what key lessons have been learnt from the implementation of the High Streets for All Challenge Fund, Good Growth Accelerator Fund and Civic Partnership Programme? And how are these lessons informing the future high street interventions and supports from the GLA? Louise, would you like to start that?
So I'll just kind of maybe open and let Tim follow in with some of the detail. But first of all, thank you for this invitation. It's a really great opportunity for us to showcase some of the work that we've been doing, and the fact that regeneration isn't just about bricks and mortar, but bricks and mortar can often be the platform that enable all the different kind of people-focused things to happen. So really pleased to be here. I guess what I would say is that our team is very much in that kind of think and do mind frame. We learn from the stuff that we do, and we bring that back to inform policy. So every time that we run a programme, we are innovating, we are doing new things, we are working with new people, addressing new issues. And every single programme that we do builds on the one that we've done before. So right back from the Outer London Fund through to the Good Growth Fund, and then on to the ones that you've asked about specifically this morning. I'll hand over to Tim to talk about those programmes now.
Thank you. The High Streets for All Challenge is a really interesting one that obviously was in response to COVID and asked for a really rapid recovery, and it was interesting as well because it was really a revenue funding program rather than the capital funding program that we previously established through the Good Growth Fund. What really was foregrounded in that program was the establishment of sort of the focus on partnership working, so using the funding in a way that really looks at local communities and try to help them articulate what their needs are to build that up to develop a strategy for that local place. I mean, what we identified early on in developing the program is that people are constrained in terms of time and resources to come together to articulate their thoughts and needs. And we complemented that funding also with expertise from the Mayor's Design Advocates, from expertise across policy agendas in the GLA that we have, be it the culture team, be it the environment team, and so on, to help, I think, people to understand how they can act upon the challenges identified. The funding was then distributed in a sort of three-stage way. The first one was an open call. The second stage was a selection of a place in every borough to work up these challenges, and these places were identified in collaboration with local authorities, and that I think was a quite innovative way at that stage to sort of make these funding allocations. And of those, then 22 went on and got further funding to develop strategies in detail, which then also led in some cases to projects on the ground, be it like the Loft in Hounslow, which is was a pop-up shop in a vacant department store, the Debenhams, for instance, or the Hackneywick project, for instance, which looked at the circular economy. The Civic Partnership Program is a program that's still very much live now, so we're not quite at the stage to take lessons to implement them for the next stage. Although what we've already learned through that program to date is that the approach that we've taken not to run an open bidding round with local authorities actually is something we really want to pursue. So that was quite distinguishable from the Good Growth Fund previously, which I think put quite a bit of burden on the local authorities or other organizations bidding in to prepare these funding bids to make them really stand out. The Civic Partnership Program takes a two-step approach by pre-selecting through the city intelligence data that we have on deprivation, on areas of growth, on areas that are on a particular sort of climate stress as well, to look through that lens and pre-select, and then through further conversation with the local authorities identify places where to possibly intervene, but before we go in with capital funding, use some revenue funding to develop these strategies. So there is that sort of learning again from the High Streets for All challenge.
Thank you very much. Microphone.
There's a really good example there of really distinct learning. You know, colleagues, in the time when we were developing the Civic Partnership Programme, we were just coming out of COVID, and what we were hearing from London councils, from boroughs, was, you know, in that period, funding was getting very kind of atomised, and there were lots of call-outs for distinct funds. So people were being asked to respond with a lot of detail on very short notice. So there was a kind of a like, please stop doing these small call-outs. And so there was this data-informed approach that gave us, this is where there seems to be a case for targeting the limited funding that we have. But, you know, we as officers worked with, you know, exec directors across London to agree, you know, you're saying this, is this data-informed approach a reasonable way for us to progress? So you're not all having to kind of respond to this, but it does mean that some of you aren't on the list. And that was, I think, a real maturing of relationships across government in, you know, London level government. But it was that sense that there is data, and then there's the kind of the relational stuff that we have to also take into consideration.
Thank you for clarifying that. Grace. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Normally it starts off with all guests, so that's where I was going. Forgive me. Okay. So Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to focus on the High Streets for All Challenge Fund, and just to kind of make sure that we don't overrun in time, maybe either Tim or Louise could answer that question. It's about the criteria that you're using to ensure that the support is reaching the right areas and the communities that need it most, and also about how effective it is and what mechanisms you're using to monitor the progress and ensure accountability.
Sure, thank you. I think in terms of the criteria, because there was a sort of selection process that involved first an open call, but then also the work with local authorities across London, I think we had very good insights, of like what kind of local needs there is overall, what the bigger picture looks like, but then also secondly, we could compare notes and drill into the further detail by comparing what local authorities thought about these different places and these bids, but also what they already do on their local patch and how effective it would be for the GLA to come in with some new funding, for instance. So I think there was a combination of perspectives that was quite useful in sort of putting that together. I mean, the challenge was deliberately sort of set out as a fund with very broad objectives. So there were sort of 5 themes. They range from social cohesion to public space to sustainability and so forth, and supporting local economy. So it was quite of a mixed bag, but deliberately, because we knew that not everything applies in every single place. So I think that was deliberately done to give as many people at all as possible to give a stake in this. It was, I think, innovation was a big thing when we set out the program. We were quite keen to get sufficient bids in and sufficient projects supported that speak to these different themes that we set out in the prospectus as well. So there's an element of curation as well, that it doesn't lean too heavy just into one thing or the other. Because what's, I think, important with all these programs is that we try to, I guess, extract some learnings that then can help others who may have funding from different sources to maybe sort of take on some of these learnings. So we run what's called the High Street Network. So that's just been refreshed, just started through what we call the High Street Classroom program this September. So that brings together local authority partners who work in high streets more generally from all sorts of departments, be it regeneration or otherwise, business improvement districts and so forth. They go on site visits, they look at projects on the ground, a bit like when we did the Wood Green walkabout, for instance. But also they establish a working group, and the first working group looks at sort of access to space on the high street to come up with some sort of quite sort of tangible sort of outputs. Hopefully it's just started, so that's something we're funding up to the end of March 26.
Will we be able to get an evaluation from you on the effectiveness, and also an evaluation on the effectiveness of the long-term benefits for the funding? Because it is quite a short-term basis that the funding is based on.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much sort of came out of COVID recovery. It was a sort of quick action-based sort of piece of work. We're still collecting the self-evaluations from the projects, but overall we've already got some sort of insights that we, I think, already shared on the website as well. So we generated from the £4 million investment, I think 4.6 million match funding, a little bit, I think around 700 businesses supported. I can't quite recall the numbers now, but like several hundred events held and community organizations involved and so on. So I think there is demonstrable impact already, and obviously we can update that once we've got all the sort of self-evaluations in place.
I just got a couple of other questions about the impact that other initiatives could have on the high street. And one of the questions I've been asking the Mayor about, and you're probably aware of this, is about liberalising Sunday trading. Have you got a changed position on this? Because the last time I asked him about it, there wasn't really much movement on this. Has the GLA's position changed at all on Sunday trading? I don't mind if Louise maybe answers that question.
There hasn't been any. I haven't been party to any conversations where that's evolved. So yeah.
And I have another question as well about pedestrianisation, which I was discussing with the other panel about. And I think, this is very relevant at the moment with the Oxford Street proposals. From the GLA's perspective, what further assessment are you doing on this particular scheme? And has there been any consultation with local residents, businesses regarding the scheme at all?
So speaking specifically to Oxford Street, so I think the thing with Oxford Street is that it has a very important local function. Of course it does. Local to people that live within half a mile, local to people that live within London, but then it's got a national and it's got a global profile as well. The engagement to date, I mean, two things that I would point to. Back in 2017, when we had done all the detailed development work with TfL, and we ran a formal consultation at that point, I'm going to say 62%, it was somewhere between 60 and 65% of Londoners supported the proposed pedestrianisation. There was a YouGov survey that happened in late September. I don't know who commissioned that YouGov survey, so I'm not suggesting I did that or we did that, but it was interesting to note that, again, the level of support at a London scale was in that 60 to 65%. So I think there is a kind of a recognition that something needs to be done. The level of engagement that we'll be doing, we are in the process of figuring out what the best mechanism is to deliver that change, and as part of that process, at the moment we're looking at models such as the Mayoral Development Corporation. That's not because we want a Mayoral Development Corporation, it's because we haven't yet found an alternative model that would hold that project over the life cycle that it needs to go through, and therefore, subject to consultation, the Mayoral Development Corporation is likely to be the model that will be used to deliver on that. but that's subject to consultation, which speaks to your question, Hina. That formal consultation will happen across the next kind of 12 months.
I know that we're running out of time, so I won't go any further, but thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. Louise, did you just say that you don't want a mayoral development corporation, as in you're using that mechanism because it's the way to go? But what would be the downsides of it being an MDC?
I guess I was just making the point that it's not like, it's not that we are seeking, we are looking for the mechanism that can help us to deliver the kind of mayoral vision for Oxford Street, and a vision that we think is supported broadly by Londoners. And we haven't kind of gone to that because we are actively choosing that. It's because we are looking at all options, and so far that seems the most viable mechanism to deliver that vision.
Is there anything about that mechanism that you think we should be worried about? Probably a better way to phrase that question, but are there any concerns about it being a development corporation?
I mean, there are costs associated with it that we have to be careful about. I think it's efficacy, isn't it? It's like, what's the most effective way of achieving it? And I think, certainly I'm quite white label about, like, how do we actually achieve the vision that we want to deliver upon? And for me, then it's about looking at all of the possible options and being honest about the pros and cons of all of them, and then choosing the most effective model to achieve that.
Thanks for the clarification. Can I ask you about the environmental goals? So what efforts are being made to ensure that high streets contribute to the Mayor's environmental goals, such as reducing emissions and promoting green spaces? And Tim, if this is more you, then either of you is fine.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. I think there's a few points. I think, first of all, we work quite closely, or very closely, with the environment team and the GLA, so really making sure that their policy objectives, but also their practical expertise, rolls into everything that we invest in through our regeneration programs. That's quite evident now on the Civic Partnership Program, which explicitly sets out addressing climate emergency as one of the 3 key objectives, alongside public realm, social infrastructure, and working with local communities. So it's really important that all the projects we fund through that hit that agenda full on, and that could be around green infrastructure, such as trees and sods, but it could also look at sort of London's water courses. So we've got 2 projects in Ilford, for instance, or in Lewisham Town Centre, where we look at reconnecting the high street and the town centre to the green infrastructure network, and sort of create a more interesting, livable environment, but also, I think, drive some of the sort of environmental benefits more broadly. I think design and construction, obviously, you need the right expertise. We also got the Mayor's design advocates. We've got lots of colleagues in our team who can help the boroughs procure the right design teams who bring these kind of expertise, and that could also be around the reuse of materials and low carbon and so on. And also rethinking what a business plan of a future operator of a building, can address these challenges post-occupancy. So that's, I think, quite critical as well.
And if I could just jump in, single sentence, I would just draw, it might be stating the obvious, but if you look at all of the kind of capital funding that's been delivered through regen programs over the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of them have been retrofit projects, actually. So we're talking about investing in assets that already exist, and then that kind of expertise that Tim was referring to helps clients and partners to think about the kind of the carbon and other dimensions that relate to kind of environmental sustainability.
Definitely, and linking in with retrofit, not demolish. Can I just check what work's being done with Re-London as well around the circular economy, particularly on high streets? It links a little bit to the conversation we had in the first panel.
Just thinking about Hackney Wick, the project we've been funding through the High Streets for All Challenge, that looked in particular sort of establishing a sort of circular economy hub around the sort of fashion cluster of fashion industry in that area. So you might not think about Hackney Wick as a sort of high street location, but it is an emerging new town centre when you look at the master plan and the growth that's happening in the area. So that's clearly an interesting, I think, example where we try to help establish these principles and let them grow.
Thank you. Can I ask, how does the GLA's High Streets data service work, and what impact has the programme had to date?
So this is another interesting one. So the High Streets for All Challenge Fund emerged during COVID. So did the High Street Data Service. And the High Street Data Service is basically collective purchasing of data around high streets, and it works with our colleagues in boroughs to make sure that instead of paying for the same data 32, 33 times, we buy it once and we actually invest the kind of money saved in the analysis. Because data is just data. It's nothing until it's analysed and then put to use. And so the High Street Data Service collectively purchases this data, and then it has analysts that can provide dashboards and different kind of outputs that are available for boroughs, subscribing boroughs to access. So there's that kind of baseline. Boroughs can also take that data and work on it locally and do what they need to do. There are interesting things about buying it collectively and doing a first cut of the data, if you like, at that city level. It allows things like, for instance, somebody working in Harlesden to look at what are the high streets that have a similar economy to Harlesden, and what are they doing? You know, what are their challenges, and what are they coming up with? So Harlesden might find that actually there's something going on in Sutton that they could learn from. And they're able to then move from, I have these challenges, to we have these challenges, to I know Liz, and then having a conversation that allows you to actually very quickly kind of network the data, the analysis, and then the knowledge, the how-to, the doing bit of it. So there's something really kind of powerful about that allows us to kind of move beyond, you know, data being seen as the thing. Well, really, it's analysis, it's insight, and it's action. That's the thing. So, I mean, that's just a really brief summary. I could go into more detail.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to add, I think it's also a service that's available to business improvement districts,
Yes.
because that came up earlier. So we know that they have got limited resources, but that's another way the mayor can help these organisations to, I think, be more precise how they use their funds to help their local places.
Thank you. You did say it's brief, and I think we've got to move on, but I'm really interested in how the analysts are interpreting it and where those narratives are coming from and things like that. Would it be easy to write to the committee with some of that information? I don't know if there's an easy document about it.
Absolutely, yes.
Perfect.
Happy to follow up. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garrett.
Hi. So from the Mayor's manifesto, the new manifesto for 24, he committed to launch a support fund and set out a new vision for the future of London's high streets and to explore planning changes. So I was just wondering what progress had been made on that. I guess that's a question for you, Louise.
Thank you. It's really interesting. It's great to see the Mayor committing to that in his manifesto, and I think it's also, I hope you've found from the site visit that you've done and the sessions you've done so far that, demonstrably the Mayor has been in the space of backing high streets and understanding the power of local economies to Londoners' kind of quality of life. There's been a journey, and this whole point about learning from programme to programme and from different experiences like COVID-19, and I guess what's happening in this administration is that the stuff that we have been doing, I think if you do the broad arc of what our team has been doing, it's been making the case for high streets, and then that case is established and funding became available. Now I think we're getting more sort of systematically embedded into the plans for growth, that idea of the everyday economy that was mentioned in the previous session. So really the Mayor is seeing the growth plan. Of course the London plan. The London plan has been consistent in supporting a town centre first, but the growth plan that's in development at the moment, that is being developed in consultation with boroughs, and we expect that it will be when that has been established, that will provide the framework that will lead to the proposal for what a high street fund will be in this administration.
What was the timeline on that? Sorry, did you say?
So the timeline will be, if I understand correctly, the growth plan there'll be a final version of that, I think, towards the end of this calendar year or early next calendar year. So that will be out at that point, and that will provide the framework for us then to make decisions about. And it will also link, of course, if we're talking about a capital fund, to the comprehensive spending review and to the funding that's actually available for London to think strategically about high streets and to fund interventions.
If I can just ask one, the bottom line question really. We've been talking about this, not just we collectively as a society have been talking about what's wrong with our high streets, what we can do about it for more than a decade, probably many decades. And here we are and all the data is still going south. Why will it be different this time? Or maybe it won't be. I mean, perhaps I presumed that in my question.
I mean, I guess what we're saying is London has a very good analysis of the value of high streets, and that's economic, but it's also social and cultural and environmental, okay? The mayor, any mayor working on their own, isn't in a position to fix this because there are massive macroeconomic changes happening and societal changes happening. But I think what you see in London is that every time that we've designed a programme, we've been very clear about the things that we are trying to prototype or we're trying to evolve that respond to that changing context. So will we fix high streets? I don't think so. Will we do something that is effective and has a positive impact on London's high streets and Londoners' experiences? Yes, I think we will. And that will build on, I think 15 plus years of research and action on streets. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to be specific about what we will impact and not claim that we'll fix.
I'll put it this way. If we had this meeting again at the end of the mayor's term, so in 3 and a bit years' time, what would you or your successor hope to be able to sit here and boast about that succeeded in that time?
Well, for example, something that's just happened recently, in the last 12 months, we had something like 8 or 9 different projects which won London REBA Awards, Design Awards, okay? We had 4 of those that won national awards, and we had 1 of those that was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, which is a big deal in terms of the design and architecture world. I'm not motivated by winning awards, but it's very interesting that in the context of a global kind of shutdown around COVID-19, in the context where you couldn't get a price for steel that would last longer, a quote for steel that would last longer than 12 hours, this programme, the Good Growth Fund, was able not only to deliver, but to deliver excellence. So in a year, at the end of this administration, if I were to say what does success look like, I would say local high streets and economies are valued and they're supported, and some fantastic demonstrator projects have been delivered that are in particular places like Oru in Sutton, for example, but that the whole of London can learn from.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. So we're now moving on to the next section, which is questions to our local authority colleagues. Assembly Member Small Edwards, perhaps you'd like to start.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. My question is to Elizabeth and to Grace. Have you had experience of working with the GLA on high street initiatives in your borough, and what impact has this work had?
Thanks. Yes, we've had extensive impact of working with the GLA within Sutton on a number of different programmes. So we've worked with them on the High Street for All Challenge, which has had a huge impact within Sutton. So through that, we formed the Green Enterprise Partnership with the Business Improvement District in Sutton Town Centre, and along with other partners as well. And that's enabled us to establish the Go Green business rates discount scheme. So we're working with a cohort of 128 businesses now who are signing up to develop plans which will reduce their carbon emissions, so halve them by 2030 and cut them by 2050, and then working to achieve those. So they get a business rates discount of 70% by signing up to the scheme and going through the accreditation and putting in place these strategies. So that's a huge impact that came out of that High Streets for All Challenge that we've worked with the GLA on, because without that Green Enterprise Partnership, the Go Green scheme wouldn't have been developed. We've also got the Good Growth Fund within Sutton, so that's supported the development of Oru Sutton. So there's a former BHS site which the council's purchased. We've had H&M going into the ground floor and part of the first floor, and then the upper floors of that large building wouldn't have been necessarily used otherwise, or could have been used for storage space. So we worked with the GLA, who initially provided a funding to look at the feasibility of that site to produce a co-working space. And then we've been able to go forward to appoint Oru Space to actually develop that. So it's a large space there. It's got individual offices, it's got wellness, it's got hospitality, a community garden, which is also funded through the Grow Back Greener Fund run by the GLA and Groundwork, alongside the Good Growth funding. And that building is opened in 2023. It's really successful, it's popular in the high street and meeting needs for a lot of different people. I think one of the other things that we've worked with the GLA on is also around housing. So we've got housing estate regeneration within our town centre, and the GLA grants are being used towards those projects to support the right type of housing for residents and also bring more housing into the town centre. And then finally, we've also worked with the GLA around support for Hong Kong residents. So there's been a number of people who've moved to Sutton from Hong Kong, around over 4,000 over the recent years. And we've worked through the GLA, the Welcome Fund, and through other funding as well, to put in place programming and support that helps welcome new communities to Sutton.
Similar to what Liz has said, we have extensive experience of working with GLA delivering on funded initiatives. So going back to 2014 when the High Street Fund was released, that's where we delivered a number of shopfront improvements, which was part of a comprehensive package linked with business support, and that was in the area of Wembley Park. So it was looking at ways to redirect traffic that would naturally go from Wembley Park Tube straight towards Wembley Park, where the stadium and the London Designer Outlet is, but actually turning right into the high street as well. So there was a visual impact that was made from the shopfront improvements, and also with the robust business support as well, and capacity building, that actually led to the development of one of Brent's first business groups, which is still going strong to date. It's been formally constituted and is now empowered enough to lever it in its own funding as well. We've also been successful and received development funding from the Good Growth Fund as well in 2018, and that led to the acquisition of a building in Harlesden called Picture Palace, which the council purchased and is now going to be a centre really celebrating African and Caribbean heritage. And at the moment, we are in the midst of looking for a long-term operator for that space as well. But there was extensive community engagement which actually fed into that. And again, it's led into the offshoots of empowered community groups and business associations as well. More recently, we are looking at the High Street Challenge Fund, where, similar to the previous projects I mentioned, we now have a formed Church End Partnership, who are a group of voluntary-led organisations, but all are taking on that role of proactive stewardship, wanting to actually be involved, you know, have a seat around the table with officers within the council to lead on projects and to help lever in funding as well. So within that programme, we have delivered several initiatives, such as establish a cooking club initiative, a robust health and wellbeing programme, which there's an appetite there. So it's a case of wanting to take the lessons from what's worked well and continue to deliver that, because we see that there is demand as well. But one of the biggest initiatives that came out of the High Street Challenge Fund is a youth anchor or youth hub provision within Church End. And that is still in the early phases of delivery, but that was very much involved the community. The concept was actually co-designed with young people, and within that, we actually want young people to be part of the whole journey, right through to actually delivering the youth space as well. So the formation of a youth advisory board is going to be one of the key outcomes from that. So we do hope to launch that space in summer of next year. And, you know, with all of these projects, I guess, it's around the heightened sense of place, sense of agency and ownership as well, because they've always been at the fore of the conversations had and part of the journey. Skills development, so capacity building programs for the businesses and residents alike, so that they are equipped to go out and lever in their own funding through the formations of these distinct business groups as well. Yeah, and proactive stewardship as well. That's one of the key things.
Thank you both very much. And one of the issues we've seen proliferate, particularly I think since COVID, is that of empty spaces, empty units. And we know that local communities really, it's something they don't like to see. I think it really blights an area when you see those empty spaces. How have you tackled the issue of vacant spaces in your town centres? And what kinds of businesses or initiatives are now filling these gaps?
I'll make a start on that one. So I think Sutton's taken a really proactive approach to try and tackle vacant units within Sutton Town Centre itself. So we have the Future High Streets Fund programme that we were successful in, which has supported development of spaces within the high street. So it's enabled us to refurbish buildings which are empty and then bring them back into use, which means that we now have a new cinema and community space which is open. We're nearly finished the refurbishment of some former retail units which otherwise, you know, they were vacant before we started the project, and that's enabling us to rent them out and bring tenants back in, and also purchase a building which had been vacant for around 10 years at the bottom of the high street, which wasn't being used, and there weren't active plans for its conversion. So the councillors purchased that building through the Future High Streets Fund to create a new space for Sutton College, which is a community learning provider, which is part of the council. So we've also purchased the shopping centre in 2021, the St Nicholas Centre, to bring that into council ownership, and are progressing a programme to enable to appoint a developer to free up the civic site, move the council into the heart of the high street to create a new civic hub, and then that leaves the civic centre for development, which creates new housing within the town centre itself as well. So we announced our developer on that recently, who's GKRL. I think generally the retail vacancy rate in Sutton Town Centre is good. It's around 8.7%, so we're below the Greater London and GB average within Sutton. And it's quite when you walk up and down the high street, it's quite busy. There's not that many vacant units. So I think some of these actions that we're taking to look at areas which are vacant and being able to bring them back into use is having a positive impact. And it's also meaning that we're attracting other occupiers in. So, for example, we've had a Pret that's opened recently in the high street, which I think gives that confidence as well.
Within the Brent context, we are proactive in terms of engaging with estate agents, managing agents when vacant properties are coming about, and really relaying the vision of what we want to see in the high street. Of course, probably similar to many councils, we don't own much stock in the high street, so it's where we can try and curate the offer to the best of our ability. We start by having those early conversations. We do have unique high streets within Brent, such as Ealing Road, which is predominantly South Asian, but Ealing Road almost has a microeconomy within the wider economy. And there's a very strong B2B network. So if a property does become vacant on the high street, a business within that B2B network would easily just snap that up as well. So we're seeing that Ealing Road probably has one of the lowest vacancies across the borough. And then where else we are working with our empowered business groups to really take ownership of the high street and, you know, just coming together where they're seeing vacant units, telling us, you know, what they want to see there as well, and of course with the residents as well. And then proactively going out there to find complementary businesses that could add value to the town centre offer if there's an appetite there. Of course, you know, we don't have controls over the rents and rates, etc. So it's only just initially facilitating the discussion, but you know, it's down to what happens to that vacant unit is out of our control thereafter.
Thank you both very much. And yeah, I'm going to shout out work being done in my own constituency in Westminster with the Meanwhile On programme. I think has done a really good job at activating some of these vacant units. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Polanski.
I think both my questions have been answered, actually. I think you can probably move on.
Oh, thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari, you had a supplementary.
I just wanted to touch on the diverse voices, but particularly on disabled residents. If I can go to Elizabeth about, particularly in Sutton, because I know that Sutton's High Street is very high and slopey and can cause particular issues. So I know that there's a buggy that you have that works quite well. Is there any other initiatives or ways of helping particularly disabled local residents to be able to access the high street as much as possible?
So we did used to have a town centre buggy that was run by the Business Improvement District, but unfortunately it's not operational at the moment. So I think it's around the right engagement and considering design of buildings at the beginning, which is one of the key elements we need to think about around accessibility, and also public transport accessibility to make sure that people can access our high street in the right way as well, which are key elements that we need to think about.
Yeah, just to echo what Liz said, it's for us it is around the engagement. Where we're delivering, for example, shopfront improvements, we will really factor that into the design going forward, especially if it is council-funded scheme as well, because the accessibility issues and levels in our high streets, admittedly isn't that great, and we do work with our partners such as Brent Mencap, who regularly feed into a consultation and just help to steer the conversation that it's wholly considered whenever we're looking at regeneration projects to create an all-inclusive, accessible high street for all.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member McCartney.
Sorry. I wanted to just examine the differences between inner London, the central zone, and outer London. And are there any different challenges that outer London faces, and how have you adapted to address these? I'll start with Elizabeth.
I think to start off with, I'd say there's some positives for outer London at the moment. I think the sort of move towards people working from home or wanting to work locally does mean that we have a larger customer base during the week. So rather than people spending their money because they work in central London and then may stay on in central London to socialise afterwards, actually they might want to access services within their local area instead. And I think that gives us a brilliant opportunity to be able to provide a different range of leisure offers, and also making sure that we've got the right office space locally that people might want to work at as well if they don't always want to work from home, but they do want to work within their borough. I think some of the key challenges are around public transport. So thinking about the orbital connection, so actually we've got some great high streets and town centres across South London. Actually getting between them can be a challenge. So I think at times it's easier to travel into central London than it is to boroughs around the exterior of London. And that's something that we need to keep on looking at about improving transport, and linked into that also thinking about late night transport options. So for people who want to socialise in the evening, but also people who might work in the nighttime economy, both within hospitality venues but other types of businesses as well, and actually making sure that they can travel through public transport, I would say, is key for outer London. I think also our business improvement districts will tend to have less funding than central London business improvement districts because the rateable value will be lower, so they end up with less funding than some in central London. So I think thinking about how we can achieve the most through those business improvement districts. They do some amazing work. We're really lucky to have two very good business improvement districts within Sutton, but there's more that they would want to do as well, and I think providing appropriate funding for them and appropriate support is really key as well to enable them to do that job.
Thank you. And Grace, do you have anything additional to add to that?
Yeah, just to add on, I would say around the rapid population growth, within our Outer London boroughs. So it does put pressure on housing, public services and infrastructure as well. Touching on the housing, Brent does suffer from high levels of overcrowding, especially in parts such as Harlesden and Woolston Green. And with, for example, with such overcrowding with flats above shops on the high street, it does have an impact on the high street. And so there's more intensified services going towards, waste and cleanliness and so forth, almost cleaning the high streets 2 to 3 times a day. And also demand for social housing as well. We've got a long list of people looking for social housing. So it's really striking that harmonious balance, when working with developers, not just looking at the private housing, but also incorporating social housing into it just to help alleviate some of the pressures when it comes to social housing as well.
Thank you. The last panel, one of our guests talked about the fact that Transport for London perhaps could do a little more about looking at its environs around, for example, its tube stations or train stations. I appreciate there's not much in Sutton, so I'm going to start with Grace. Do Transport for London engage with you when you're talking about those local high streets and what you can do to improve?
Yes, we do work closely with Transport for London, especially within our larger regeneration programmes. So we've got a regeneration programme at the moment in Church End, which is one of our more deprived town centres. So we're working with TfL on that scheme. And there is an appetite, I would say, from the local community looking at redirecting some of the bus routes so visitors can actually feed into the town centre, but it actually opens up the town centre for a bit more capacity and activities within. So that's one of the kind of key examples that comes to mind with working with Transport for London.
Yeah. And of course, Elizabeth, Neil would probably tell me off, but of course you've got the tram. Or do you have the tram down in Sutton yet or not? A little bit. So I don't know whether your engagement with TfL has supported your work or not.
I think we don't. I mean, we do work with Transport for London, I think, through our highways team. I think the engagement that we need with Transport for London as well, that we do work with them on at the moment, is looking at, I suppose, some of the red routes that run through the borough as well. So, for example, think about, we've got a gyratory around the town centre, we've got, various red routes that run throughout Sutton. So actually thinking about those types of schemes with Transport for London beyond the stations themselves is also important.
Thank you. And I wonder if I could have another question. I think we're fine for time. It's just to Louise or Tim. It's about this Outer London issue. I know there's a lot of focus at the moment about how can you revitalise the central activity zone, but how are you making sure that funding is still going to Outer London in your work?
Well, I guess that's partly, Tim was explaining the kind of the detailed thought and structuring that goes into any of those programmes that we do. And that's always looking to kind of balance the deployment of funding, because we don't want to be only in one part of London. Every time we do a project somewhere in London, we're doing it for that place, but also for London to learn. So it's really important that we are in all types of places in London. So I would just say that we take into account that inner and outer balance when we're kind of curating the awards that we're providing to boroughs or partners in the community.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Georgia.
Grace, this one's specifically for you. So thank you for all your contributions so far. And as someone that spends a lot of time in Brent Cross on the border of Brent, spending far more money there than I should. But my question to you is, given the proximity of Brent to Harrow, both administrations have taken very different views, particularly when it comes to parking and the relationship with that and revitalising the high street. So I won't ask you to comment on Harrow, but in terms of Brent, and particularly North Brent, where it's a bit more suburban than the south of the borough. How do you find that dichotomy works? Do you take different approaches, positives, negatives, things like that?
Thank you for the question. Admittedly, I don't have too much detail on this because, we do work closely with our colleagues in sustainable travel, and we do have an active travel strategy at the moment. So I wouldn't be able to kind of further comment and touch upon that, but it's something I can revert back to you on.
No, don't worry. I don't want to create more work for you, but I appreciate that I think when looking at certain London boroughs, Brent is a unique example, is that you have that mix of suburban and urban, north to south, and sometimes east to west, in particular in Brent. So, but it is fine. I'm sure the details will be on the website, but I appreciate you trying to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. My question to both of you is what further support could both the Mayor and central government offer to ensure that high streets remain resilient in the face of future challenges? I wonder, Elizabeth, if you could start.
Thank you. So I think the grant funding that's been provided has been really important to progress our work within Sutton Town Centre from the GLA, and also the funding we've received through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has been really important as well. So I think continuation of funding streams which are flexible enough that they respond to local need and they're not overly prescriptive is really important, and also for them being provided for a long enough period that actually we can plan projects, we can deliver them, knowing that particularly where you're doing construction projects, they do take time to go through the processes. So I think that's a really important element. And actually, even thinking about three things back to Oru Sutton, and actually the feasibility funding we got at the beginning to explore that funding through the first stage of the Good Growth Fund was really important to us to then help form a project that we could take forward and apply for further funding from. I think thinking about things like the business rates retention sort of linked back into funding as well. So Sutton's has received funding through the Strategic Investment Pot, which has supported the development of the London Cancer Hub. But also we've used funding through the Strategic Investment Pot Business Rates Retention Pilot for Oru Sutton and the creation of that building as well, and it's created workspaces across other South London boroughs through the Big South London programme. So that we've now, across the South London Partnership, sub-regional partnership, all got workspaces available for small businesses because of the support through the Strategic Investment Pot. So that's been a really important area for us. And I think continuing to promote Outer London and recognising it as a place for investment as well, recognising the visitor economy that's available, the commercial opportunities which are available there, as well as other things that we can deliver as well. So I think being aware of what's available, the opportunities in South London and other Outer London boroughs, and being able to promote those as part of London is a really important aspect.
Thank you. Grace?
Yeah, I think Liz has covered much of it, but the only thing I would like to add is that where there is, the fantastic funding support that has been here to date, having that access to extend existing programs, especially where it is initially 100% capital, that revenue-based support is needed so that we can empower our community groups. Brent doesn't have a business improvement district, but where we do have community partnerships such as business associations, etc., that revenue support for them to actually provide that long-term management of this project, so these projects become sustainable and last the course long after the funding has gone away.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask a final question, which is very locally based, and we've got a really great mix here of North and South London. And it's based on Assemblymember Garrett's question about success, which I like very much. I wonder, looking 5 years down the line and your particular areas, what would you regard as success? So, Grace, would you like to start?
I think within the high streets, it's realising that vision of having very adaptive and flexible high streets which look far beyond retail. And actually, we talk about experience-driven high streets, and that's something that many of Brent's high streets do need, where we're actually attracting people from far and wide, not just to Wembley or Ealing Road, but to other parts of the town centre, to actually spend time there, dwell there, even have people looking to invest in the area, as opposed to moving out into some of the other areas in the periphery of Brent as well. And having those established community groups, I'm really curious and interested with the concept of the community improvement district, or even the conversations around a tourism levy as well, so that there is that long-term funding. So we're not always having to rely on external funding, but there's that long-term pot that we can continue to deliver things and reach the ambitions of our local community.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I think from my side, it's some real progress on the major regeneration schemes that we have within Sutton Town Centre. So we're at very early stages of things like the St Nick's and Civic regeneration programme, and also the move of Sutton College as part of the council's move out of Civic site. So I think coming back to Sutton Town Centre in 5 years' time, seeing some real progress there, and actually we don't know what's going to happen over the next 5 years in terms of growth of online shopping, how working patterns might change. So I think it's having that type of town centre that, as Grace mentioned, can be flexible to meet future needs as well, and that we're continuing to see people visit the town centre because it is meeting their needs would be what we'd like to see.
Thank you very much. So we've now reached the end of our session, and we are well in time, which I'm really stunned about. So thank you, everybody, for contributing to that. I'd like to thank all of our guests for attending today's meeting and for your responses to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the site visit to Wood Green High Road on the 15th of October 2024? And the date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 9th of December at 2 p.m. here in the chamber at City Hall. Thank you very much.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.